which is Idaho's school choice, a reality check. This comes by the Idaho Freedom Foundation by Ronald M. Nate, PhD. Despite this rhetoric from elected officials and educators about a variety of options parents have to secure the best education for their children, the reality is that these choices are limited to public options, such as other public schools or charter schools. Recently, as some of you may remember, the governor proposed a plan to add a mere $605,000 to, quote, accelerate, end quote, charter schools, a move that some critics have deemed almost insulting. The current system requires parents who want to opt for choice beyond public school to pay twice, once for taxes and a second time for private tuition. This, critics argue, is not a true choice, but a system designed to protect the public education complex, with children and their future bearing the brunt of the impact. In the article from IFF, two statistics are highlighted about the issue. First, reading and math proficiency for Idaho 8th graders on the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP, has shown almost no progress in the last 19 years. Second, despite tripling state spending on schools and education since 2003, student performance has remained stagnant. All that said, there are some proposals in the works to provide some form of school choice. As discussed recently on the podcast, Senator Den Harding and Representative Horman are proposing an education tax credit bill, which would reimburse or even repay families for private school tuition when they choose education options outside the public school system. While not comprehensive, it is a start and could introduce competition for education dollars, potentially improving both private and public schools. However, until such measures are implemented, critics argue that the school choice in Idaho remains a myth. To achieve a real school choice, they say legislatures must change the propaganda and demand results for the significant investment Idaho is making in education. Which, we've talked about this a bit. The main reason I brought up this is not to beat a dead horse, but there were 2 points that the Idaho Freedom Foundation article gave that I thought were very insightful. And the first of those, which we can go over, is the proficiency scores. So we'll go into the numbers in a second here, but let's just put it this way. Idaho has spent a lot of money since 2003 to 2022 on education. And in that time, for Idaho 8th graders on that national standardized test, right, they got just about 32 to 28%. That's not great if you look in the biggest context. Idaho has struggled as a whole to get its education numbers up compared to the rest of the nation. And this is just talking about public schooling as a whole. We just suck at it. Well, then 19 years later, we look at those proficiency scores after we spent all this money and everything, right? And we're at 32% yield and about 32% proficiency. So we've raised our proficiency by 4% over a 19-year gap and a lot of funding, which is not great. The Idaho Freedom Foundation gives some numbers here on this. I'm going to quote them. Here again, you'll have to go figure out where they're getting these exact numbers from, but just quoting from the article. The raw numbers are startling. This dismal outcome reveals 15,983 third graders who cannot read at grade level, leaving only 7,521 who can, which that also is very concerning because if you can't read, there's a lot of things you can't do. But then I guess giving its full context, if we look at the money amount.
All right, so I took a little time and I crunched some numbers here. And what's interesting is that the population in Idaho was 1.36 million in 2003. In 23, it's 1.94. So equating to today's dollars, in 2003, it was at about $1.15 per person in Idaho to fund schooling. We've increased that to be $1.65 per person in Idaho for schooling. So we've increased our spending per person by 50 cents per person in the last 20 years. And our numbers have not increased at all.
Right.
So the question I had was, all right, so we're spending a bunch more on education, but also our population has grown. Is our spending growing commensurate with our population? And the answer is no, not at all. Our spending is growing drastically more than our population. If our spending hadn't grown more than our population, then I would look at those numbers and be like, well, yeah, we spent the same amount on education per kid. We're getting the same product out. Like no shocker there. The fact that we've increased spending as much as we have, so, we've doubled the amount of money we're spending on education and we're getting the same results. Like, what on earth? This is obviously not, spending more money obviously isn't helping the problem.
Independent of the fact of if we're looking at these numbers, right? If we're talking about getting Idaho off of the federal government spending where we're not reliant on it, I think a big start of that would be, let's figure out a way to spend that $3 billion, right, with a B, of education money on forms of education that actually are more efficient so we can decrease the amount we need to spend to get the same result, or better, hopefully. But we can't keep going either increasing spending, which we've been doing, or just keep going with the form that education has always gone in Idaho. We need something different because it's not working. It hasn't worked for, according to these numbers, it's looking at almost the past 2 decades.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like something, again, the basic sense is something has got to happen. Something's got to give here. Like we cannot just keep increasing spending, because we can look at various school districts around the country and see that the school districts that spend the most money per kid produce some of the worst students. You start talking about school districts in LA or New York or Boston where they spend exorbitant amounts of money per student. And the students that come out of those school systems are not well-educated students. I was going to say something more disparaging, but I'll not talk about their character. I will talk about their education. Their education is really bad. And so you talk about, okay, what is the best thing that you can do to educate children? I was listening to Ben Shapiro debating a guy by the moniker of Destiny. I don't remember what his name is. And it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. They talked about education, and Destiny's point was, well, how can we spend money to better educate children? And Shapiro's response was, family. Have a family. A mom, a dad who love each other and are living together. That's it. That's thing number 1 and thing number everything else. And then encourage kids to not have children before they graduate from high school. Like, that's thing number 2. But that's thing number 2 after 10 things of mom and a dad in a household. Like, you take care of those 2 things and you've solved the vast majority of your school problems. So then the real question is, how do we encourage families to stay together? And so if we as a society, we as a government entity can encourage that somehow, that's going to make our scores and our children more educated, more than any other thing we could possibly spend money on. So I don't know how you encourage that, but that has to be the way that we go with the money that we spend in this state on education. We have to encourage the family.
I don't have much to add on that, and I would say that was a point that I kind of missed as we were going into this, because I was stuck in nerd world looking at all the numbers. And okay, kind of there, return on investment, right. I'm being Mr. Economics over there, which that's a really valuable point. But as we said, we were going to try to skim over this and not beat a dead horse. So maybe we achieved that, maybe we didn't. But we'll continue on with the show here.